Moon Chronicles Chapter 8 Sacrifices. The night was a canvas of crimson, painted with the blood of our failures and fears. I crouched behind an overturned dumpster at the edge of town, my breath ragged, my hands trembling so violently that they barely managed to grip the silver knife in my hand. The air reeked of decay, an olfactory reminder of what was happening mere blocks away. Mike Anderson had been taken, not by some clumsy monster, but by the vampire lord himself, a being who moved with a predator's grace and spoke with a voice that could make your soul quiver in its boots. Victor, a name that now tasted like ash on my tongue. I watched from my hiding spot as he dragged Mike through the deserted streets of what used to be our hometown. The crimson moonlight illuminated their figures, Mike, bruised but still defiant, and Victor, moving with an almost unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. His black eyes gleamed with anticipation, like a cat playing with a mouse before the final pounce. "Rhonda," Mike had whispered to me earlier, his voice thick with pain from where they'd rearranged some of his fingers. "Don't come after me." I had squeezed his hand tighter, feeling the wetness of blood mixing with my sweat. Like hell I won't. And now here we were. Me, a survivor who had somehow managed to avoid becoming a monster's midnight snack, and Victor, who was leading Mike toward the clock tower at the town center, the same place where all this madness seemed to have begun. The journey there was a nightmare in itself. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Every sound made me jump. Was it footsteps? Was it something worse? I kept low, keeping Victor and Mike within my sight while staying just far enough away to remain hidden. When they reached the clock tower, what I saw nearly broke my spirit completely. The once beautiful structure was now a monument to horror. A makeshift altar of some kind had been erected at its base, covered in strange symbols drawn in something that looked suspiciously like blood, and surrounding it were the transformed werewolves with matted fur and yellow eyes, vampires whose pale skin seemed almost luminous under the blood moon's gaze. Victor pushed Mike toward the center of this gruesome tableau, where a stone pedestal stood waiting. With brutal efficiency, he bound Mike to it using chains that sizzled against his flesh upon contact, silver no doubt. "I've been looking forward to this," Victor said, circling around Mike like a predator sizing up its prey. "Your friend has been inconvenient." Mike spat at him, a small act of defiance that made me smile despite the horror unfolding before my eyes. "Go to hell," he managed to get out between gasps of pain as Victor tightened one of the chains, causing fresh blood to well up from where it cut into Mike's wrist. Victor laughed, a sound like tinkling glass that made my teeth ache. "I'm already there, my friend, and now you'll be joining us." With that, he produced a dagger from within his coat, silver, with an intricate design carved along its blade that seemed to pulse with an inner light under the crimson moon. "Tonight," Victor declared, raising his voice so all could hear despite being alone in this desolate part of town now transformed into something out of a nightmare, "we will complete our ritual, and your sacrifice will help ensure that humans everywhere will finally understand their proper place in this world." Before Mike could respond further, or before I could devise some plan to save him, Victor plunged the dagger deep into his chest, not into his heart immediately but rather into what appeared to be the center of his sternum, causing a guttural cry of pain from Mike that echoed through the silent night air, like a wounded animal's plea for mercy. Blood poured from around where the blade was embedded in flesh, dark crimson liquid that pooled beneath him on the ground and ran in rivers down Victor's hand as he held the dagger steady. But something else was happening too. I could see it even from my position hidden behind the dumpster 100 yards away. The blood wasn't just flowing freely. Instead, it seemed to be moving, almost as if guided by some unseen force, forming strange patterns on Mike's skin where it touched him, symbols similar to those drawn at the base of the clock tower altar. Victor began chanting in a language that sounded both ancient and alien to my ears, a series of guttural syllables that seemed to vibrate through my entire body even from this distance. With each word he spoke, the symbols formed by Mike's blood grew more complex, branching out across his chest like veins of pure darkness against pale skin. Mike's eyes rolled back in his head momentarily before snapping forward again, now dilated so widely they appeared nearly black themselves except for thin rings of blue around their edges. He was still conscious, but barely, his breathing ragged, his body trembling as if fighting some internal battle I couldn't see or understand fully yet. "Mike!" I whispered urgently from my hiding spot, knowing full well that any attempt to rescue him now would likely result in both our deaths given the number of transformed creatures surrounding Victor and his altar. "Hang in there!" As if sensing my presence despite being hidden, Victor's head snapped toward where I was crouching behind the dumpster, his black eyes seeming to pierce through shadows themselves before returning to focus on Mike once more. "You'll do," he said with a chilling smile that didn't reach those inhuman eyes. "Your friend's blood is rich with potential." With these words, Victor twisted the dagger embedded in Mike's chest, causing another cry of pain from him, followed by fresh crimson rivers flowing freely now as the wound was reopened further still. More symbols formed along his skin where blood touched flesh. They pulsed faintly under the crimson moonlight like living things somehow brought to life through this ritual being performed upon him. I watched in horror as Mike's body began contorting, unexpectedly given that I had assumed Victor intended to kill him rather than transform him into something else entirely. His bones cracked audibly even from where I hid nearby, and his skin rippled with dark fur sprouting along parts of his arms and legs before retreating again moments later, as if unsure whether it wanted to become werewolf or remain human after all. What was happening? Was Victor trying to turn Mike into something new entirely? A hybrid perhaps combining elements from both vampire and werewolf forms simultaneously? And why? What purpose could possibly justify such an act of horrific transformation being inflicted upon another living person? "Rhonda," Mike managed to get out between gasps for air as he struggled against the chains binding him, now glowing red-hot where they touched his skin, burning deeper into flesh with each passing moment. "Run!" I wanted to obey, to flee back into whatever safety might still exist in this town, transformed into something resembling a nightmare under the blood moon's crimson glow, but I couldn't leave Mike like this, not when he was being subjected to such torment before my very eyes, despite our best efforts earlier tonight, trying to stop Victor from completing whatever ritual it was that would help ensure all humans everywhere would understand their proper place in this world according to his twisted vision of things. "Hold on," I shouted back at him, knowing full well that doing so might draw attention toward myself, yet unable to stand by idly while someone who had become important to me during these past days since everything changed was suffering so terribly before my very eyes. "I'm coming!" As if summoned by my words, or perhaps simply reacting to the knowledge that I remained nearby despite his attempts at convincing me otherwise earlier, Victor turned toward where I hid once more, his black eyes gleaming with what could only be described as malevolent glee at having witnessed another's suffering up close like this. "Ah!" he said smoothly, stepping away from Mike momentarily before beginning to walk toward my position with deliberate, measured steps that seemed almost too slow somehow given how quickly events had been unfolding throughout our brief encounter thus far. "The other one remains." I backed away slowly, keeping myself hidden behind the dumpster as best I could, while making sure not to make any sudden movements that might give away exactly where I was located, despite knowing full well that doing so would only delay the inevitable momentarily rather than prevent what came next entirely. "Stay back," I warned him, holding up my silver dagger, which felt pitifully inadequate now when faced with such power as Victor clearly possessed, and wishing desperately that we had managed to bring more weapons or reinforcements along during our journey through these deserted streets toward whatever fate awaited us here at the clock tower tonight. Victor laughed again, that same chilling sound like tinkling glass that seemed almost mocking in its dismissal of any threat I might pose, despite having witnessed firsthand how capable he was of inflicting harm upon others, without breaking a sweat or showing even the slightest hint of remorse for doing so. "You think little toys like that can stop what's coming?" he asked, gesturing dismissively toward my dagger as he continued moving ever closer to where I remained hidden behind my makeshift cover, now increasingly inadequate given how close Victor was getting with each passing second. "This ritual has been prepared for centuries, planned out in meticulous detail by beings far more ancient than either of us could possibly imagine." With these words, Victor raised his hand slightly, and suddenly the werewolves surrounding Mike began moving toward where I hid, not charging exactly but rather approaching with slow, deliberate steps that seemed almost cautious, somehow as if unsure whether they should be attacking or waiting for further instructions from their master before proceeding any further. "Leave her alone!" Mike shouted weakly from where he remained bound to the altar stone, his voice strained yet still defiant despite all he had already endured during this ordeal thus far. "She has nothing to do with any of this." Victor paused mid-step, turning his attention back toward Mike briefly before returning it once more toward me, as if considering whether or not there might be some merit to what his captive human companion was saying about my involvement, or lack thereof, in whatever grand design he had in mind for bringing about the transformation that would help ensure all humans everywhere would understand their proper place in this world according to his vision of things. "Perhaps," Victor finally conceded after several moments spent weighing these considerations against one another internally within his own twisted mind. "But she is here now, and like it or not, she has become part of what comes next, whether either of you likes it or not." With that pronouncement made clear, he raised both hands toward the blood moon hanging high overhead in the sky, now crimson bright enough to cast long dancing shadows across everything below, despite being nighttime still technically speaking here under its gaze. As he did so, strange symbols began glowing along his skin, the same ones now visible upon Mike's flesh where blood had formed them earlier during his torture at Victor's hands. The air itself seemed to vibrate with energy, something ancient and powerful that made my teeth ache even from this distance as I watched these events unfold before me helplessly, yet unable to look away despite knowing full well how horrifying they truly were when viewed objectively, rather than through some filter of hope or denial about what might happen next. "Now!" Victor shouted toward the heavens above, his voice carrying unnaturally far across empty streets transformed into something resembling a battleground between light and dark forces at war against one another beneath this cursed moon's crimson glow. "The ritual begins," as if summoned by these words, or perhaps simply responding to some internal signal given by Victor himself without needing any verbal command beyond what had already been spoken aloud moments earlier. The werewolves surrounding Mike began howling in unison, a sound that seemed almost physical somehow as it vibrated through my entire body despite remaining hidden where I was behind cover still. From within the clock tower itself, now transformed into something resembling an altar dedicated to whatever ancient power Victor served while performing this ritual tonight, a beam of crimson light erupted forth, striking directly down upon Mike's bound form with blinding intensity that made me wince even from this distance, as if looking directly at the sun were painful enough under normal circumstances without adding supernatural elements into play here too. Mike screamed, not just in pain but also perhaps in terror as his body began contorting once more, this time more violently than before as bones cracked and twisted unnaturally beneath skin that rippled with dark fur sprouting along arms and legs before retreating again moments later, only to reappear somewhere else entirely across his changing form which seemed caught between human and something else entirely at this point. "Stop it!" I shouted, knowing full well how useless such pleas would be against whatever power Victor commanded here tonight, but unable to remain silent any longer while witnessing another person suffer so terribly before my very eyes, despite all efforts made earlier trying to prevent exactly these kinds of events from happening in the first place. "Leave him alone!" Victor turned his attention toward me once more, his black eyes seeming to pierce through shadows themselves, as if seeing directly into where I remained hidden behind cover, still now increasingly inadequate given how close he was getting with each passing second since beginning his approach earlier. "Courageous," he said, a faint smile playing across lips that seemed too red somehow, against pale skin illuminated by crimson moonlight filtering down from above. "But foolish." Please stay tuned for the next installment of Moon Chronicles. It's been a real pleasure. Oh, by the way, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you soon, my friends.